He stood near the center of the room, in a midnight black Tom Ford tuxedo, a titanium Patek Philippe on his left wrist, catching the light every time he raised his glass. At 39 years old, Garrett had become the thing magazine covers were made of. Founder and chief executive of Ashford Capital Ventures, a private equity firm that had turned a modest family inheritance into a portfolio worth north of $900 million. Forbes had profiled him twice. Bloomberg called him once a quarter. His face had graced the cover of Fortune magazine under a headline that read, "The Man Who Never Loses." But headlines, as anyone who has ever been the subject of one knows, are just beautiful lies printed on glossy paper. Garrett smiled at the woman speaking to him, a venture capitalist from Zurich, whose name he had already forgotten, and nodded at the right pauses. He had mastered this, the performance of presence, the theater of a man who appeared to be exactly where he wanted to be. He laughed when she made a joke about emerging markets. He touched her elbow when he made his own. He signaled for another drink before the first one was finished, because holding a full glass meant no one could offer to get him one, which meant no new conversation he did not choose. Control. That was the architecture of Garrett Ashford's entire existence. Every room he entered, he had already mapped. Every handshake was calculated. Every silence was strategic. But there was one room he could not map, one space that defied every algorithm his mind had ever built, the room inside his chest where Nadine Palmer used to live. He had not spoken her name out loud in 3 years. Not since the divorce was finalized in a courtroom on the 14th floor of the Cook County Courthouse, where she had sat across from him in a navy blue dress, her dark brown eyes holding something he had never seen in them before. Not anger, not sadness, something worse. Resolution, the quiet, terrifying peace of a woman who had made a decision she would never unmake. Garrett had expected a fight. He had prepared for one. His legal team, 4 attorneys from the most prestigious family law firm in Chicago, had built a case designed to make the proceedings swift, clinical, and entirely in his favor. He had anticipated tears, accusations, the theater of a woman scorned. He had braced himself for the moment she would bring up the affair. The photographs, the whispered phone calls she was never supposed to hear. Instead, Nadine had looked at him once, just once, at the very beginning, and then she had turned to face the judge and never looked at him again. She had asked for nothing, no alimony, no share of the business, no claim to the properties, the cars, the accounts. Her attorney had submitted a single-page filing, requesting the dissolution of the marriage and nothing else. Garrett's lawyers had been stunned. His mother, Vivian Ashford, who had watched from the gallery like a queen observing the exile of an unwanted consort, had smiled. And Garrett? Garrett had felt something crack inside his sternum that day. A hairline fracture he told himself would heal. It did not heal. 3 years later, it had only deepened, splitting wider with every season, every hollow achievement, every woman whose name he forgot before morning. Now he stood in the most expensive room in the city, surrounded by 400 of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard, and he felt it again. That fracture, pulsing. Psychologists who study the aftermath of divorce often speak about a concept called identity reconstruction. When a marriage ends, particularly one that was central to a person's sense of self, the individual does not simply lose a partner, they lose a version of themselves. The person they were inside that relationship, the habits, the rituals, the private language, the future they had jointly imagined, all of it disintegrates. And what remains is not the person they were before the marriage. That person is gone too. What remains is a stranger wearing familiar skin, forced to answer a question most people never have to ask past adolescence. Who am I now? Garrett Ashford had answered that question the way men of his particular disposition often do. He had answered it with velocity. More deals, more acquisitions, more hours in glass-walled conference rooms making decisions that moved markets. He had answered it with women whose faces blurred together, relationships that lasted 6 weeks at most, each one ending the same way, with him reaching for his phone at 2 a.m, scrolling to a contact he had never deleted, staring at her name and putting the phone face down on the nightstand. He had answered the question of who he was without Nadine by becoming more of everything except honest. The gala tonight was for the Children's Literacy Coalition, a nonprofit Garrett had funded for 5 years, primarily because it generated excellent press coverage and because his publicist had told him that philanthropy softened his image. He did not care about softening his image. He cared about the fact that Nadine had once told him, during a late night in their kitchen in Lincoln Park, that she believed literacy was the closest thing the world had to a universal key. "You teach a child to read," she had said, stirring honey into chamomile tea, "and you hand them the lockpick to every door that was ever closed in their face." He had funded the coalition the next morning. She never knew it was because of her. That was the thing about Garrett. The things he did out of love, he disguised as strategy. The things he felt deeply, he performed as indifference. And the woman he had loved more than any deal, any dollar, any version of success his family had ever prescribed for him, he had destroyed with the oldest weapon in the masculine arsenal. He had made her feel like she was not enough. 3 years and 4 months before the gala, Nadine Palmer had stood in the master bathroom of the home she shared with Garrett on Lakeview Avenue, gripping the edge of the marble vanity with both hands, staring at her reflection, and asking herself a question that would change the trajectory of her entire life. Is this who I am now? The woman in the mirror did not look like the Nadine Palmer who had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in biochemistry. She did not look like the woman who had been accepted to 3 medical schools and chosen Johns Hopkins because her grandmother, Opal Palmer, had told her, "Baby, if you're going to dream, dream so big it scares the people who doubted you." She did not look like the woman who had walked into a Chicago art gallery on a rainy Thursday evening 6 years ago and locked eyes with a man across the room who looked at her like she was the only painting worth studying. The woman in the mirror looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind of tired that lives in the marrow, the kind that accumulates when you spend years slowly, almost imperceptibly, shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's idea of who you should be. Garrett had not asked her to leave medical school. He had simply made it logistically impossible. Dinners with investors that required her presence. Weekends at his mother's estate in Greenwich that could not be missed. A slow, elegant suffocation dressed up as partnership. And Nadine, who had loved him with the kind of ferocity that only first loves generate, had allowed it. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself she would go back. She had told herself that supporting his vision was the same as building her own. She had told herself 1,000 lies, and she had believed every single one, until the phone call. It was a Wednesday. She remembered that because she had been preparing for a dinner party, arranging calla lilies in a crystal vase Garrett's mother had given them as a wedding gift. His phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter. She had glanced at it without thinking, the way you glance at a clock, reflexive, meaningless, and she had seen the name. Sienna, and beneath it, a message that dismantled everything. She did not scream. She did not throw the vase. She did not call her mother, or her sister, or her best friend. She stood there for 11 minutes, she counted, holding a white calla lily between her fingers, feeling something inside her shift, not break, shift, like tectonic plates that had been grinding against each other for years finally giving way, not with an earthquake, but with a quiet, irreversible settling. She put the lily in the vase. She finished arranging the flowers. She hosted the dinner party. She smiled at Garrett's colleagues, and laughed at their wives' jokes, and poured wine with steady hands. And that night, after Garrett fell asleep, she lay beside him in the dark, and began to plan her departure with the same methodical precision he used to plan acquisitions. It took her 6 weeks. She found an apartment. She retained an attorney. She opened a bank account in her name only. She did all of this without a single tremor in her composure, because Nadine Palmer had discovered something about herself in that moment with the calla lily. She was not a woman who fell apart. She was a woman who made decisions. What Nadine did not know on the night she finalized her plan, the night she packed 2 suitcases and left while Garrett was in New York closing a deal, was that she was carrying 3 lives inside her. The pregnancy was confirmed 9 days after she left. Triplets. The doctor had said the word twice, as though repetition might make it less astonishing. Nadine had sat on the examination table in a clinic on the south side of Chicago, wearing a paper gown that crinkled every time she breathed, and she had laughed, not because it was funny, because the universe had a sense of timing that bordered on cruelty. She considered telling him, She sat with that consideration for 72 hours.
I can't be in a marriage that I'm always disrespected.
Turning it over like a stone in her palm, examining every angle, every outcome, every possible future. And then she remembered Vivian Ashford's voice at the last family gathering, low and precise, cutting through the noise of polite conversation. "Garrett, darling, I have always said, the bloodline is the brand. One must be intentional about legacy." Vivian had looked directly at Nadine when she said it, not at her. Through her, Nadine imagined her children, 3 lives not yet the size of plums, growing up inside that architecture of judgment. She imagined custody battles funded by Ashford money. She imagined her children learning that they were a brand before they learned they were loved. And she decided. She moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where her cousin Monique owned a small house with a guest cottage in the back. She applied for a position as a research assistant at a biotech startup. She began studying for the MCAT again, at night, after her shifts, with a fury that surprised even her. And when Elijah, Amara, and Solomon were born on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 weeks early, each of them small enough to fit in her 2 hands, she held them against her chest and whispered, "I will build a world for you. It will not be the biggest world, but it will be yours." Identity reconstruction, psychologists say, is not a single event. It is a process, often spanning years, in which a person dismantles the self that was shaped by the relationship and reconstructs a new self from the raw materials of their own values, desires, and truths. It is grueling work. It requires mourning not just the person you lost, but the person you were with them, the person who no longer exists. For Nadine, this reconstruction happened in fragments. It happened when she passed the MCAT with a score in the 97th percentile, while breastfeeding twins at 3 in the morning and rocking Solomon's bassinet with her foot. It happened when she enrolled in a medical school program designed for non-traditional students and sat in a lecture hall at 34 years old, surrounded by 23-year-olds, and felt not embarrassment, but electricity. It happened when she looked in the mirror for the first time in years and saw not the woman Garrett had slowly diminished, but the woman Opal Palmer had raised. By the time the triplets were 2.5 years old, Nadine was in her 2nd year of medical school, specializing in pediatric neurology. She had published a co-authored paper on early intervention strategies for developmental delays in premature infants. She had been invited to present at a conference in Atlanta. She had built a life that was small and loud and full of juice stains and textbooks, and 3 toddlers who looked so much like their father that sometimes, in a certain light, it stole her breath. Elijah had Garrett's jaw, square and stubborn, and his gray-green eyes. Amara had his dimples and his habit of tilting her head when she was thinking. Solomon had his hands, long-fingered and expressive, and his laugh, that low, rolling laugh that started in the belly and worked its way up like thunder deciding to be gentle. Nadine loved them with a violence that frightened her. She loved them the way women love the proof that they survived. She never Googled Garrett. She never checked his social media. She never asked Monique, who kept loose tabs on Chicago society gossip, for updates. She had excised him from her daily consciousness with surgical precision, and the wound had scarred over into something that resembled peace. But scars, as any surgeon will tell you, are not the absence of damage. They are the body's memory of it. And memory, unlike a marriage, cannot be dissolved by a judge. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in March, tucked inside a cream envelope with gold leaf edging, addressed to Dr. Nadine Palmer, care of the Charlotte Medical Research Institute. It was from the Children's Literacy Coalition, inviting her to attend their annual gala as a featured guest, in recognition of her recently published research on language development in premature-born children. Nadine stared at it for a long time. She knew, in the way that a body knows things the mind refuses to articulate, that the gala would be held in Chicago. She knew, in the way that a scar knows the blade that made it, that Garrett Ashford funded the Children's Literacy Coalition. And she knew, in the way that a woman who has rebuilt herself from the foundation up knows anything, that walking into that room would be the single most terrifying thing she had done since walking out of his house with 2 suitcases 3 years ago. She almost declined. She drafted the email. Polite, professional, regretful, prior commitments, teaching obligations, the children. She had the cursor hovering over the send button when Monique walked into the kitchen, saw the invitation on the counter, and said 5 words that changed everything. "Nadine, you earned this, girl." And she had. That was the part that mattered. The invitation was not about Garrett. It was not about their history, their wreckage, the life she had left behind. It was about her work, her research, her mind, the very thing she had nearly surrendered in the fog of a marriage that demanded she be decorative rather than brilliant. She deleted the draft. She accepted the invitation, and she booked 3 seats on a flight to Chicago, because Elijah, Amara, and Solomon had never seen the city where they were conceived, and because her mother, Joyce Palmer, had agreed to fly in from Detroit to help with the children during the event. On the night of the gala, Nadine stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room at the Palmer house, and she saw someone she recognized. She wore a floor-length emerald gown with a draped neckline, simple, architectural, the kind of dress that does not compete with the woman wearing it. Her locks were pulled up and twisted into an elegant crown, threaded with thin gold wire that caught the light like intention. She wore her grandmother's earrings, small gold hoops that Opal Palmer had worn to church every Sunday for 40 years, and a single ring on her right hand, a band of hammered gold she had bought for herself the day she passed the MCAT. She was not Garrett Ashford's ex-wife. She was Dr. Nadine Palmer, and she was going to walk into that room, standing in the full height of every single thing she had become. The grand atrium of the Kensington Royal Hotel held 412 guests on the night of the gala. Garrett knew the number because his assistant had confirmed it that afternoon. He also knew the seating chart, the wine selection, the keynote speaker's credentials, and the estimated media coverage the event would generate. What he did not know, what no amount of preparation could have told him, was that in approximately 40 to 7 minutes, the most carefully constructed version of himself would be dismantled by a woman in an emerald dress. But we are not there yet. For now, Garrett was doing what Garrett did best. He was performing. He moved through the room like a man born to it, which he was. He greeted the mayor's wife by her first name. He complimented a hedge fund manager on a recent acquisition he had read about in the Financial Times. He posed for a photograph with 3 board members, tilting his chin the way his publicist had taught him, a 1/4 inch to the left, which apparently communicated both authority and approachability. At one point, his date for the evening, a woman named Paige Whitfield, a 32-year-old art curator he had been seeing for approximately 3 weeks, touched his arm and asked if he was having a good time. "Of course," he said, and he smiled the smile that had been on the cover of Fortune magazine, the one that showed teeth but never reached the eyes. Paige was beautiful. She was intelligent. She was the kind of woman his mother approved of, which should have been a warning, but which Garrett, in his current state of emotional vacancy, registered as convenience. She wore a red dress and diamond studs, and she looked at him with the particular admiration of a woman who did not yet know him well enough to be disappointed. Garrett excused himself to use the restroom, not because he needed to, but because he needed 3 minutes away from the performance. He stood at the sink, ran cold water over his wrists, and stared at his reflection. The fracture in his chest was pulsing again. It did that at events like this, gatherings dense with the trappings of a life that looked, from the outside, like the definition of success. He knew what the fracture was. He had always known. It was the space Nadine had occupied, the space that had not been filled by money or prestige or any of the 17 women who had cycled through his life since the divorce. He dried his hands. He adjusted his cufflinks. He walked back into the room, and that was when he heard her name. It came from a cluster of women standing near the bar, 3 of them, well-dressed, holding champagne, engaged in the kind of animated conversation that signaled genuine interest rather than social obligation. "Have you read the Palmer study, the one on language acquisition in premature infants?" "Yes. She is supposed to be here tonight. The Institute invited her. Dr. Nadine Palmer." The name hit Garrett in the center of his chest like a fist wrapped in velvet. He stopped walking. His hand tightened around his glass. A waiter passed in front of him, briefly blocking his view. And in that 2-second interval, Garrett Ashford's entire body went through a chemical transformation that neuroscientists would recognize as a massive sympathetic nervous system activation. His heart rate spiked, his pupils dilated, his skin flushed with heat beneath the collar of his shirt. Nadine Palmer was here. In this room, tonight. He turned slowly, scanning the atrium with the desperate focus of a man searching for shore. The room was vast, over 12,000 square feet of marble and crystal and candlelight, and there were hundreds of people between him and any clear line of sight. He moved toward the east wall, where the crowd thinned near a display of student artwork, trying to find a vantage point, trying to see her before she saw him, trying to prepare himself for a moment he had imagined 1,000 times but never truly believed would come. And then the crowd parted. Not dramatically, not like in a film, just the natural ebb and flow of bodies in a large room, two couples stepping aside to greet friends, a waiter redirecting to avoid a collision, a woman bending to adjust her shoe. A seam opened in the human fabric of the gala, a corridor of empty space no more than 15 feet long, and at the end of it, framed by candlelight and the enormous arched window that overlooked Lake Michigan, stood Nadine. Garrett's champagne glass slipped in his hand. He caught it, barely, the crystal stem sliding against his damp palm, and he stood there, immobilized, staring at a woman he had not seen in 3 years and 2 months, a woman who looked so fundamentally different from the person he remembered that for one disorienting second he wondered if he had made a mistake. The Nadine he remembered had been beautiful, but her beauty had been quiet, contained, a candle burning in a room with the curtains drawn. The woman standing across the atrium was not a candle, she was a controlled fire. She stood with a posture that communicated not arrogance but arrival, the squared shoulders and lifted chin of a person who had walked through something terrible and come out the other side not just intact, but expanded. Her gown caught the light in waves of emerald. Her locks were a crown. Her eyes, those dark brown eyes that he had once watched soften with love and then harden with resolve across a courtroom, were surveying the room with the calm, unhurried assessment of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. She was radiant, not the performative radiance of someone trying to be seen, but the organic radiance of someone who had done the deep, brutal work of becoming herself. Garrett felt the fracture in his chest split open like a fault line, and then he saw the children. There were 3 of them. They were standing beside her, arranged in the way that small children arrange themselves around their mother, orbiting her like planets, tethered by gravity and the invisible threads of absolute trust. A girl in a lavender dress with white patent leather shoes. 2 boys in matching navy blazers with tiny bow ties, one slightly taller than the other. They were approximately 3 years old, maybe a little younger, and they were, all 3 of them, breathtakingly beautiful. Garrett registered the children first as a fact, the way you register any detail in a room, chairs, paintings, people. Nadine has children. The thought was a needle, thin and sharp, and it pierced him in a place he did not expect. She had moved on. She had built a life. She had done the thing he had not been able to do. She had filled the space, and then Elijah turned his head. The boy, the taller of the 2, turned to look at something across the room, and the light from the chandelier fell across his face, and Garrett saw it. He saw it the way you see a ghost, with every rational part of your brain screaming that it is impossible, and every primal part of your body screaming that it is real. The jaw, square, stubborn, set at the exact angle Garrett saw in his own mirror every morning. The eyes, gray-green, not brown, not hazel. Gray-green, the color of a winter lake, the color that had skipped Garrett's father and landed in Garrett, the color his mother had always called the Ashford signature. Garrett stopped breathing. His gaze moved to the girl, Amara. She was laughing at something, her small face tipped upward, and there they were, dimples so deep they could hold rain, carved into her cheeks in the exact location where Garrett's own appeared when he smiled. And she tilted her head, thinking about something, the way Garrett tilted his head in board meetings when he was calculating, a gesture so specific, so unmistakably inherited, that it bypassed cognition entirely and hit him somewhere primal. And then Solomon, the smaller boy. He was holding Nadine's hand, and his fingers, long and expressive and already articulate at 3 years old, were wrapped around her index finger, and they were Garrett's fingers. His hands, his mother's hands, 3 generations of Ashford genetics, miniaturized and holding onto the woman Garrett had let go. The glass did fall this time. It slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor, sending a spray of champagne and crystal fragments across his shoes. and the sound cut through the ambient noise of the gala like a gunshot. Several heads turned, including Nadine's. Their eyes met across 40 feet of marble and candlelight, and 3 years of silence, and the room contracted around them, as though the universe had decided that 410 other people were suddenly irrelevant. Nadine's face did not change. That was what destroyed him. It did not change. No shock, no fear, no flicker of the old vulnerability he had exploited so carelessly during their marriage. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a chapter she finished reading long ago, with recognition but not longing, with memory but not need. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked down at Solomon, adjusted his bow tie with gentle fingers, and turned to greet a woman who had approached her with an outstretched hand and an enthusiastic smile. She dismissed him, not with cruelty, with something far worse, indifference. "Garrett?" Paige's voice materialized beside him, tinged with concern. "Are you okay? You dropped your glass." He did not answer. He could not answer, because his throat had closed around a sound that he would not, could not allow to escape in this room. A sound that lived somewhere between a gasp and a groan, and a name he had not spoken aloud in 3 years. Garrett. Paige again, her hand on his arm now, firmer. "I'm fine," he said. The lie came out smooth, automatic, the product of years of practice. Slippery glass. "Excuse me." He moved. Not toward Nadine. He was not ready for that. He might never be ready for that. But toward the far end of the bar, where the crowd was thinner and the air was cooler, and he could press his palms against the polished wood and try to reassemble the fragments of his understanding. 3 children, triplets, 3 years old, gray-green eyes. The math was not complicated. The timeline was not ambiguous. Nadine had been pregnant when she left. She had carried his children, 3 of them, through a pregnancy alone, through what must have been an incredibly high-risk delivery, through 3 years of diapers and midnight feedings and first words and first steps. And she had done it all without telling him. She had done it without him, because he had made himself into a man not worth telling. The weight of that understanding settled onto his shoulders like a physical load, compressing his spine, bowing his head toward the bar. He pressed his knuckles against the wood until they whitened. This is what identity reconstruction looks like from the other side, the side of the person left behind. When Nadine rebuilt herself, she had necessarily built a life that did not include him. And in that life, his children, children who carried his eyes and his jaw and his hands and his dimples, had learned to walk and speak and laugh and dream without ever knowing his name. He had done this, not with a single act, with a pattern, 1,000 small choices, each one a brick in the wall that eventually sealed her out. Every late night he chose the office over the bedroom. Every dinner where he let his mother's coded contempt go unchallenged. Every time he looked at Sienna, a woman who demanded nothing and therefore threatened nothing, and chose the comfort of emptiness over the terrifying fullness of real love. Garrett Ashford had not lost Nadine Palmer. He had spent years meticulously, systematically, teaching her that she was better off without him. And she had learned. It was not Garrett who initiated the encounter. It was Margaret Chen. Margaret Chen was 71 years old, the former dean of the University of Chicago's School of Social Work, a board member of the Children's Literacy Coalition, and a woman who had known Garrett Ashford since he was 12 years old and pulling books off shelves at the Family Foundation's library. She was also, on this particular evening, approximately 2 glasses of Sancerre past the threshold of diplomatic restraint. She had seen Nadine arrive. She had seen the children. She had looked at those 3 small faces, and then looked across the room at Garrett, and she had done what any 71-year-old woman with 2 glasses of wine and 0 remaining tolerance for masculine foolishness would do. She decided to intervene. "Garrett, darling." She appeared at his elbow with the terrifying efficiency of a woman who has spent 5 decades navigating rooms full of powerful men. "Have you seen the research presentations in the East Gallery? There is a brilliant young doctor here tonight, a specialist in pediatric neurology, and her work on language development in premature children is extraordinary. You simply must meet her. After all, you fund the coalition that brought her here." "Margaret, I am not. This is not a good time." "Nonsense. Come." She took his arm with a grip that belied her age and steered him through the crowd with the determination of a tugboat guiding an ocean liner. Garrett, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself unable to resist a 71-year-old woman in a beaded jacket. They crossed the atrium. The crowd seemed to part for Margaret the way it had parted for Nadine, not because of wealth or power, but because of the particular authority that radiates from women who have stopped caring about approval. And then they were there, standing in front of Nadine Palmer and 3 small children, who were, at that moment, sharing a plate of strawberries with the solemn concentration that only toddlers bring to fruit. "Dr. Palmer," Margaret said, with the bright, performative warmth of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, "I would love to introduce you to the gentleman who funds the coalition. This is Garrett Ashford." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which Garrett stood 2 feet from the woman he had married and betrayed and lost, close enough to see the thin gold wire in her locks, close enough to smell the fragrance she wore, something warm and resinous, not the perfume she had worn during their marriage, something new, something that belonged to the woman she had become rather than the woman she had been. Nadine looked at Margaret, then she looked at Garrett, and then she did something that broke him more completely than anything she had done in the courtroom, more completely than her silence, more completely than her refusal to ask for anything in the divorce. She extended her hand. "Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice was level, warm, even, professional. "It is a pleasure. Thank you for your support of the coalition's work." She was treating him like a stranger. Garrett took her hand. Her skin was warm and dry. His was cold and damp. The handshake lasted 2 seconds, 3 at most, and in that window he felt the entire history of their relationship pass through the point of contact like an electrical current. 6 years of love, 2 years of erosion, 1 year of implosion, 3 years of absence, all of it compressed into the pressure of her palm against his. "Dr. Palmer," he said, and his voice almost held, almost. There was a hairline fracture in the second syllable of her name, and he saw Nadine register it. A flicker in her eyes, brief as a match strike, and then it was gone, replaced by the composed warmth of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind, who had known this encounter was possible from the instant she accepted the invitation, and who had decided, long before tonight, exactly who she would be when it arrived. Margaret, who missed nothing, looked between them with the sharp eyes of a woman who was beginning to suspect she had not introduced strangers, and then Solomon tugged on Nadine's dress. "Mama," he said, in the clear, carrying voice of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned the concept of volume control, "that man has the same eyes as me." The world stopped, not metaphorically. For Garrett, in that moment, the rotation of the earth, the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the 12-piece orchestra playing Coltrane in the corner, all of it ceased. There was only Solomon's voice, high and certain and devastating, and the words that hung in the chandelier-lit air like smoke from a detonation. Margaret Chen's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Her eyes moved from Solomon to Garrett, from Garrett to Elijah, from Elijah to Amara, and then, slowly, with the dawning horror of a woman who realizes she has accidentally detonated a bomb at a charity event, from Amara back to Garrett. The resemblance, now that it had been named, was impossible to unsee. It was not subtle. It was not a matter of vague similarity. Standing in the light of the grand atrium, 2 feet from their father, Elijah, Amara, and Solomon Ashford, though they did not carry his name, wore his face. 3 small mirrors, reflecting a man who had not known they existed. Several people nearby had heard Solomon's declaration. A woman in a silver gown turned to look. A man holding a whiskey glass lowered it slowly, his gaze tracking between Garrett and the children with the uncomfortable fascination of someone witnessing a private catastrophe in a public space. Nadine moved first. She crouched down to Solomon's level, cupped his face in her hands, and said with perfect calm, "Lots of people have similar eyes, baby. It is one of the beautiful things about the world. Shall we go find Grandma Joyce and get some cake?" It was masterful. It was a redirect so smooth, so loving, so precisely calibrated, that it simultaneously answered her son's question, protected his innocence, and communicated to every adult within earshot that this conversation was not going to happen here. Not tonight. Not on anyone's terms but her own. She stood. She smoothed Solomon's blazer. She met Garrett's eyes one final time, and this time there was something in her gaze that had not been there before. Not anger, not accusation, a warning, a boundary drawn in eye contact alone, as clear as any legal document, as binding as any court order. Do not.
I used my hand to scatter something beautiful. I'm so hurt.
Those eyes said, not here, not now, not like this. She took Elijah's hand. She took Amara's hand. Solomon held onto her dress. And Nadine Palmer walked away from Garrett Ashford for the second time in her life, leaving him standing in a puddle of chandelier light with a 71-year-old woman who was staring at him with an expression that combined pity, fury, and the unmistakable look of someone who had a great many questions. Garrett, Margaret said quietly. He did not answer. Garrett Ashford. He turned to look at her, and whatever Margaret saw in his face made her soften. The fury drained. The questions retreated. What remained was the face of a woman who had spent 50 years studying human beings and who recognized, in this man's expression, something she had seen 1,000 times in her career. The face of a person who has just realized that the life they thought they were living was a lie, and that the truth, the real truth, has been growing and breathing and learning to walk in a city 400 miles away. I did not know, Garrett said. His voice was barely audible. Margaret, I did not know. She placed her hand on his arm. I believe you, she said. And then, because she was Margaret Chen, she added, but that, my dear, is precisely the problem. Garrett left the gala at 11:47 that evening. He did not say goodbye to Paige. He did not thank the organizers. He did not shake hands with the mayor's wife or pose for final photographs. He walked out of the grand atrium through a service entrance, descended a concrete stairwell, pushed through a fire door, and stood in the alley behind the Kensington Royal Hotel, pressing his forehead against the cold brick wall, breathing. 3 children, his children, 3 years of their lives, gone, not taken from him. He was honest enough, in this raw and bleeding moment, to acknowledge that, not stolen, forfeited, surrendered by a man who had been so busy constructing a monument to his own success that he had not noticed the most important thing in his life walking out the door. Identity reconstruction is often discussed from the perspective of the person who initiates the departure, the one who leaves, who rebuilds, who discovers new dimensions of selfhood. But there is another side, the person who remains, the person who, because they did not choose the rupture, often cannot begin their own reconstruction. They are frozen in the moment of departure, locked in a version of themselves that the other person outgrew, left behind, transcended. For 3 years, Garrett had been frozen. He had added layers of success, of wealth, of social capital, but beneath those layers he was still the man in the courtroom, watching Nadine refuse to look at him, feeling the first crack in the sternum and doing nothing to understand what it meant. Now, standing in an alley that smelled of kitchen grease and rain, he understood. He had not just lost a wife. He had lost 3 years of fatherhood. He had lost first steps and first words and 3 a.m. feedings and the weight of a small body falling asleep on his chest. He had lost the sound of his own children learning to say his name. He had lost the chance to be the thing his own father had never been. Present. And the cruelest part, the part that made him press his forehead harder into the brick until the rough surface bit into his skin, was that Nadine's decision to keep the children from him was not irrational. It was not vindictive. It was the logical conclusion of every piece of evidence he had given her about the kind of man he was. She had protected their children from the version of him that existed inside their marriage. The question now, the question that would define whatever came next, was whether that version was the only one. He pulled his phone from his jacket. He opened his contacts. He scrolled to a name he had never deleted, a name that sat in his phone like a headstone, marking the place where something vital had died. Nadine Palmer. His thumb hovered over the call button. Inside the hotel, on the 23rd floor, Nadine Palmer sat on the edge of a hotel bed, watching her 3 children sleep. Elijah was on his back, arms flung wide, taking up far more space than a 3-year-old should reasonably occupy. Amara was curled on her side, clutching a stuffed elephant named Basil. Solomon was pressed against Nadine's pillow, his small face turned toward the place where her head would be, as though even in sleep he needed to know she was near. She had not cried at the gala. She had not cried in the elevator. She had not cried while brushing 3 sets of teeth and reading 2 bedtime stories and singing the song her grandmother used to sing, low and sweet, about a river that carries you home. She cried now, quietly, the way mothers cry, with her hand pressed against her mouth and her body angled away from the bed so the shaking would not wake them. She cried not because seeing Garrett had broken her. It had not, she was long past breaking, but because Solomon had looked at his father and recognized himself, and because that recognition, innocent and devastating, had revealed the one crack in the life she had so carefully built. Her children did not know their father, and one day they would ask why, and she would have to answer, and the answer, no matter how she framed it, no matter how gently she delivered it, would contain a wound. She wiped her face. She steadied her breathing. She lay down beside Solomon, pulling Amara close, resting her hand on Elijah's outflung arm, and she stared at the ceiling of a hotel room in a city she had fled, and she whispered the same words she had whispered on the night they were born. I will build a world for you. It will not be the biggest world, but it will be yours. But even as she said it, she knew that the world she had built was about to be tested, because Garrett Ashford had seen his children's faces, and whatever else he was, whatever failings and fractures defined him, he was a man who, once he wanted something, pursued it with the full, terrifying force of his considerable resources. And he wanted them. She had seen it in his eyes, in that moment before she walked away. Not just recognition, not just shock, hunger. The hunger of a man who has just discovered that the thing he has been mourning is not dead. It is alive, it is 3 years old, and it has his eyes. Down in the alley, Garrett put his phone back in his pocket. He would not call tonight. A call tonight would be reactive, emotional, the act of a man operating from shock rather than intention. And if there was one thing 3 years of hollow success had taught him, it was that the important things require more than impulse. They require change. He straightened his jacket. He stepped out of the alley onto Michigan Avenue, where the April wind off the lake hit his face like a correction, sharp and clarifying. He looked up at the hotel, 23 stories of lit windows, and he wondered which one was hers. He did not know that she was behind the 7th window from the left, lying beside 3 sleeping children who wore his features like a question he had not yet earned the right to answer. He did not know that Solomon had said, just before falling asleep, "Mama, the man with my eyes looked sad." He did not know that Nadine had closed her eyes when her son said it, and that she had felt, for the first time in 3 years, the scar tissue shift. What he knew was this: tomorrow, the sun would rise over a city that contained his children, and for the first time since the divorce, the fracture in his chest did not feel like damage. It felt like a door. The call came at 8:15 in the morning. Nadine was in the hotel restaurant, cutting Solomon's pancakes into small squares while Elijah methodically separated his scrambled eggs into 2 distinct piles, the ones he would eat and the ones he would push onto Amara's plate when she was not looking, and Amara was drawing on a napkin with a crayon she had produced from a pocket that Nadine was certain had been empty 5 minutes ago. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Chicago area code. She knew, the way a body knows the weather before it arrives, the way a scar knows the season that made it. She knew. She let it ring. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4. Solomon looked up from his pancakes. "Mama, your phone." 5 rings. She picked it up. She did not say hello. She simply held the phone to her ear and waited. And in the silence, she could hear him breathing, the jagged, uncertain breath of a man who had rehearsed 1,000 openings and forgotten all of them. Nadine. His voice, stripped of performance, stripped of polish, stripped of every layer of armor he had spent 3 years welding into place. Just her name, spoken the way he used to say it in the dark, in the early years, when they would lie tangled together in a bed that felt like the only country they needed. She closed her eyes. "Nadine, please. I need." "I know what you need, Garrett." Her voice was steady. Her hand, the one not holding the phone, was pressed flat against the table to keep it from trembling. "But what you need and what my children need are 2 very different things. And I stopped prioritizing your needs 3 years ago." Silence. She could hear the city behind him, traffic, a distant horn, the mechanical hum of a world that kept moving regardless of what any single human heart was doing. They are my children too. He said it quietly, not as a challenge. As a wound. Nadine opened her eyes. She looked at Elijah, who was now trying to convince Amara that the rejected eggs were actually special eggs and therefore desirable. She looked at Solomon, who was building a small tower out of pancake squares with the architectural focus of a future engineer. She looked at Amara, who was drawing what appeared to be a cat with 7 legs, or possibly a spider wearing a hat, and who was ignoring Elijah's egg propaganda with the serene disinterest of a child who has already learned that her brother's sales pitches are not to be trusted. They were hers. Every sell, every laugh, every tantrum, every 3 a.m. fever, every first word and skin knee and bedtime song. She had built them from the inside out, alone, and the life they knew was the life she had given them. But Solomon had looked at Garrett Ashford and said, "That man has the same eyes as me." And in that sentence, a door had opened that Nadine could not close, not because she lacked the strength, but because closing it would mean denying her children a truth they would one day need. "They are your blood," she said carefully. "But they do not know you, Garrett, and blood is not the same as belonging. You do not get to walk into their world because your DNA is in their faces. You earn entrance. You earn it slowly and carefully, and with the understanding that if you damage them, if you bring even a fraction of what you brought into our marriage into their lives, I will disappear so completely that no amount of Ashford money will find us." Another silence, longer this time. "I understand," he said. "You do not," Nadine replied. "But I am willing to let you learn, under my terms, on my timeline, with their well-being as the only metric that matters." She could hear him exhale, a long, shaking breath, the sound of a man encountering a threshold he had not expected, not a door slammed shut, not a door flung open, but a door with conditions, a door that required him to become something he had never been, worthy of entry. "What happens now?" he asked. Nadine looked at her children, 3 small lives, unaware that their story was being rewritten in real time by a phone call between 2 people who had once been everything to each other and were now navigating the strange, uncharted territory between strangers and family. "Now," she said, "you wait, and you think very carefully about who you want to be. Not for me. I have already decided who I am. For them." She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the table. She picked up Solomon's fork and finished cutting his pancakes into squares, and when he looked at her with those gray-green eyes, his father's eyes, and said, "Mama, are you okay?" she smiled and said, "I am perfect, baby. Eat your breakfast." And somewhere across the city, standing on the balcony of his penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, Garrett Ashford held a dead phone to his ear and stared at a skyline he had conquered, and he understood, for the first time, that conquest was not the same as connection, and that the most important thing he would ever build could not be measured in dollars or deals or magazine covers. It could only be measured in the willingness to change, and change, unlike success, cannot be performed. It must be lived. If this story made you feel something, subscribe and turn on notifications, because part 2 is coming, and what Garrett does next will either redeem him or destroy the last chance he will ever have. The question is not whether he loves them. The question is whether love, after this much damage, is enough